Welcome to Module 3 on Construction and Small Infrastructure Projects. In this part of the training, we move from general procurement issues into what actually happens on the ground once a contract has been signed. So the focus here is very practical: how to use the reporting template tool to spot typical corruption patterns in sector-specific contracts, namely focusing on works, but we'll also relate this back to goods and services and how to record what you see in a precise and neutral way. We will come back again and again to three main corruption schemes linked to the implementation phase of public procurement, looking closely at how each question in the reporting template tool helps you to detect and document them. Now, before we get into the monitoring questions for construction found in the tool, I wanted to briefly situate them inside the wider project. So you'll see here that iMonitor 2.0 is the second phase of a European project on corruption risks in public procurement. It takes everything that worked in iMonitor 1.0 and scales it up. So at the heart of the project, you'll see here that there are three simple building blocks. Firstly, data-driven risk assessment. Instead of choosing contracts at random, the project uses open tender to flag procedures and contracts that look risky on paper, mainly because of the procedure being used, the number of bidders, modifications, or any other red flags that have been spotted. Secondly, civic monitoring of contract implementation. That's where you come in. So trained monitors use a common questionnaire to look at specific contracts in much more detail, checking how they were awarded, how they're being implemented, and what's actually happening on the ground. And thirdly, actionable reporting. Findings are written up in a structured way on the Moniton platform so that they can be shared with public authorities, used to investigate journalists, or even to involve law enforcement when serious irregularities are suspected. Now, in this second phase, iMonitor 2.0 has a much stronger thematic focus than before. A big part of the work here concentrates on construction and small infrastructure projects, which will be the main focus of Module 3. Whereas Module 4, you'll see much later that this will build on narrowing the scope to focus on environmental and climate-related investments, exactly the type of contracts you'll see that we use as examples in this module. So when you see the questions in the reporting template tool, once you've selected works, I want you to keep one simple picture in mind. Data helps us choose the contracts, civic monitors investigate them, and then solid evidence can be used by institutions that have the power to act. Now, if we take a closer look at the project scope, this map shows how the project has expanded in the new phase. iMonitor 1.0 worked in 4 regions: Spain, Italy, Lithuania, and Romania. It proved that data-driven civic monitoring can actually trigger follow-up by institutions. Now, iMonitor 2.0 keeps Spain, Italy, and Romania, but it also adds Poland, Bulgaria, France, and Albania. So we now have 7 participating countries with a different legal system, different procurement practices, and all very different types of construction projects. So the first key activity here is to use open tender to spot high-risk contracts in all these countries. The indicators have been refined so that they can better capture climate-related spending and also typical risk patterns in construction and small infrastructure. Whereas the second key activity is the reporting tool on Moniton. That's the online questionnaire that you will be using throughout, so it allows monitors in all 7 countries to describe problems in the same structure, for example using the 3 corruption schemes that we will be using throughout this module and get familiar with. Number 1 being unjustified modifications and scope creep, 2 substandard or undelivered works compared to what has been paid, and lastly 3 irregular or phantom subcontracting. Now, the third key activity here is training. The project invests a lot in building skills for civic monitors, as you know, not only on how procurement works in general, but also on how to recognise corruption risk patterns in real contracts and how to document them clearly and safely. So, if we take a closer look, Module 3, the one that we're in now, focuses on construction and small infrastructure implementation through a 4-part series, whereas as mentioned, Module 4 will go much deeper into environmental and climate measures to those same projects. Together they should help you move in a general interest in integrity to a very concrete check and balance that you can perform on actual sites in these 7 countries. So, where does Module 3 fit in and why works are at high stakes? Before going into the details, let's place Module 3 in the bigger picture. Here, quality infrastructure is essential for economic growth but also climate and environmental goals, and also for basic services like roads, water and schools. At the same time, there's still a huge gap between the infrastructure citizens need and the funding that's actually there and available. So because of that gap, public authorities and investors are increasingly looking for projects that can show credible proof of integrity but also value for money. So one of the ways the international community has been doing this is through certification schemes such as the Blue Dot network. The Blue Dot Network is basically a quality label for infrastructure that pulls together 80 plus international standards into 10 elements. This will be gone through in the next few slides, but these schemes reward projects that follow strong standards on not only just transparency, but also anti-corruption and sustainability. Now, it's important to note here that Module 3 is not about giving a certification, but the logic here is very similar. The reporting template tool for monitors generates small, concrete pieces of evidence, whether that means works matching payments, whether contract changes are justified, or whether the companies on site match what has been actually written down in the contract. So, in other words, this module helps you recognise when a project looks like a high-quality, well-governed infrastructure project and when there are warning signs that money or integrity may be at risk. Now, on this slide, you will see the 10 elements of the so-called Blue Dot Network. This is a global framework developed by several governments with support from the OECD to define what a quality infrastructure project should actually look like in practice. The elements cover the full range of concerns, from sustainable and inclusive growth to climate resilience, to value for money over the full life cycle, to protections against corruption and fair access to services, and so on. So for this module, only 2 elements are particularly relevant, namely Element 5, which focuses on ensuring value for money over the entire life of the asset, and Element 7, which focuses on preventing corruption while promoting transparent procurement and consultation processes. Now, you of course do not need to memorize these elements, but the key takeaway here is that when you use the reporting template tool carefully, you are collecting exactly the kind of factual information that a serious quality infrastructure assessment would rely on. So your work is part of a much larger effort to make infrastructure both sustainable and clean through spotting red flags before projects actually become corrupt. Now, by the end of Module 3, you should be able to do 4 main things. Firstly, recognise why construction and small infrastructure projects are structurally high risk and sector-specific for corruption. Now, how these risks show up in everyday implementation details are also very important. But secondly, applying a risk-based approach. That means you focus your limiting time on the points in a project where corruption or mismanagement could cause the greatest harm, such as through large value items, repeated contract modifications, or maybe they'll come up in patterns in subcontracting and delivery. Thirdly, use the reporting template tool in a consistent way in order to document what you actually see, especially around contract modifications, subcontracting, quantities, quality, and payments. And fourthly, work in a spirit of openness. In integrity terms, openness means feeling safe to raise questions, describing concerns, and recording anomalies. Even if you don't yet know if there's actually a legal violation, the role here is not to accuse anyone, but to create a clear factual picture that others can review later on in the process. So before we talk about corruption in more detail, a quick but important reminder about safety. Construction sites can be dangerous, as you all know, so always check what permission is needed in order to access the site and respect any rules given by the site manager or the contracting authority. Use appropriate personal protective equipment required, helmets, high-vis vests, closed shoes, and so on. Stay within the designated safe zones. Never enter restricted areas just to get a better picture, or if you want a better angle for a photograph, it's not worth it. So don't interfere with the works or workers. Your role is clearly to observe and record. If you do see a situation that looks unsafe or you think it's an emergency, of course prioritise human safety and follow local emergency procedures first. Only once the situation is stable should you continue monitoring. So safe behaviour on site is a non-negotiable part of responsible monitoring. A simple way to think about construction projects is the so-called golden triangle, also known as the iron triangle, since it represents the interconnected constraints that you can see here: scope, time and cost. They all must be balanced for a successful project. Scope is what you should be built or delivered at the beginning. So for example, the length of a road, the number of classrooms, the type of pavement, or the environmental mitigation measures. Now, time is the schedule itself, so when the works should start and when they should be completed. Cost, on the other hand, refers to the contract value and the pattern of the payments. Changing one element, like the project's timeline or budget, will inevitably impact the others, often including the project's quality. So how these are interdependent. You'll see here on the screen that in an honest project, these 3 elements move together. So if the scope genuinely changes, there will usually be a justified modification to time and cost. If there are delays due to legitimate reasons, then there will of course be a clear explanation in the documents. In a risky project, however, scope, time and cost start to drift apart. Costs go up without clear reason. You may see that time has been extended again and again. Extra works appear because of this that look more like a new contract rather than a small adjustment. So achieving the desired overall quality means the constraints must be managed in tandem. If you try to rush a project or cut costs too much, it could compromise the quality of the final build. Now, many of the questions in the reporting tool you'll see focus on sector-specific construction, which all in all are really asking, does the story about scope, time and cost still make sense? This is the core corruption scheme number 1, which we will get into in the following slides. Here you see the 3 main corruption schemes in implementation. So corruption scheme 1, as mentioned, is unjustified contract modifications or scope creep. This is when a contract has been formally changed in ways that are not actually clearly justified, or you might sometimes see it as lots of small changes gradually turning the project into something very different than what was originally tendered. Now, corruption scheme 2 refers to substandard or undelivered output compared to payment. This is when invoices and payment orders suggest that the project has been fully or largely delivered, but on site you find missing works, lower quality materials, or environmental measures that were never implemented in the first place. Corruption scheme 3, on the other hand, is irregular or phantom subcontracting, so that's when companies that actually carry out the works are not the ones listed in the contract, and when front companies are used to hide who's actually benefiting, or when subcontracting has been used to channel money to politically connected firms. So across all 3 schemes, you see here that conflicts of interest and connected suppliers are treated as what are known as risk factors in the background. They don't necessarily prove corruption on their own, but they do definitely help explain why suspicious patterns appear. Now, this is the blue dot network element 7 that we referred to earlier. So think of the big dark blue box at the top as the overall promise. If a project wants to be recognised as blue dot quality infrastructure, it has to show that it's both protected against corruption and procedure in a transparent way, also being procured in a transparent way. So this translates into, can we trust the contract, the money trail and the companies on site? Exactly what you're checking as a monitor. Now under that, the chart splits into 2 green themes. On the left, anti-corruption, and on the right, transparent procurement. They're not 2 separate worlds. In practice, on a small construction or infrastructure project, which you've probably seen through, for example, a village road, a drainage upgrade, or even a school extension, they are 2 sides of the same coin. Now, if we walk through briefly some of the blue boxes and connect them to your monitoring work and our 3 corruption schemes, for anti-corruption, if we take a look at 7.2, this is exactly what you're doing when you use the reporting template with our 3 schemes. These are your lenses. So you're not just spotting individual problems, you're helping to map where the risks lie in real contracts. Now taking a look at 7.3, this is where we're in the heart of corruption scheme 1 and corruption scheme 2. So when you check whether modifications are properly signed and published, or whether payments match the actual progress on site, you're testing whether the project's books and records tell a truthful story. So missing addenda, vague justifications, or full payments for half-finished works are all signs that this element 7.3 is not actually being respected. Now if we take a look at 7.4, that's actually where you come in directly. So citizen monitors, NGOs, journalists, all of you are part of the independent monitoring that Blue Dot is asking for. When you document access denial, mystery companies, or maybe you've seen weak supervision, you're giving future auditors concrete starting points. Now, the basis for all of Step 1 and Step 2 questions of the reporting tool, which rely on contract value variations and payment orders, are embedded in 7.7. So if that information is not available, it becomes much easier for corruption scheme 1 and 2 to flourish because nobody outside can see how public money is actually flowing. But if we take a look at the transparent procurement side of things, 7.8 relies on your desk analysis in Step 1 from whatever is being publicly disclosed. So that includes tender notices, maybe you've looked at award decisions, contracts, addenda, and so on. So what that information means is that if it's missing or incomplete, it's not just an inconvenience for you, it's a sign that element 7.8 is very weak. We're not investigating cartels in this module, but of course the patterns that you see here in 7.11, the same group of firms rotating wins or closely related companies bidding against each other are all symptoms that relate directly to this expectation. Now 7.13 again, that's where your role is formally recognised. So Blue Dot says that high quality infrastructure should welcome independent observers. It shouldn't treat them as enemies at the gate. So when you note repeated access obstruction or supervisors who never visited the site, you're actually indirectly showing that 7.13 isn't being met in practice. Now, of course, you don't need to memorise all of these numbers, but what I do want you to see here is the connection to our 3 corruption schemes. They're not random inventions, they're exactly the kind of problems that Element 7 is trying to prevent. So every clear observation that you enter in the reporting tool, whether it be about modifications, payments, quantities, subcontractors or supervision, they are all small pieces of evidence about whether this project is living up to these Element 7 expectations or not. So when you stand in front of a small bridge or next time that you're at a local park with your checklist, you're not just filling in a form, you're helping to answer a much bigger question. Does this public investment meet the same integrity standards that serious international partners are expecting from quality infrastructure? That's the spirit of the Blue Dot Element 7, and it is the wider framework into which all of Module 3 fits. So now if we take a look at connecting these 3 schemes to the international language used in the Blue Dot network, specifically Element 7 that we've just gone through, think of it as the quality benchmark for how an infrastructure project should actually behave. So if we walk around the triangle here, at the top you'll see our corruption scheme number 1. When contract changes are not properly justified, or maybe you'll even see them hidden in a chain of small addenda, they directly undermine the idea that contracts and changes are transparently disclosed. As you saw, Element 7 expects that financial information on contracts and payments is out in the open and that corruption in procurement has been clearly prohibited. But if the modifications are too opaque or copy-paste, it becomes much harder to see who's actually benefiting and why. So a project can still tick the box contract approved, but in reality the rules on disclosure and clean procurement are being hollowed out. Now on the right you'll see our corruption scheme 2. Here the problem is very simple. The paper says one thing, the street says another. Element 7 talked about keeping fair and accurate books and supporting independent monitoring and auditing of the project. So let's take if all the documents and payment certificate says 100% delivered, but on site you've seen that only 70%, then the books are not just a bit sloppy, they are also misleading. So in accounting terms that would mean that the records cannot be trusted, but also any audit that relies on them will miss the real loss of public money. So let's take for instance a development bank later wants to certify this project under a Blue Dot type scheme. They won't actually remeasure every road, but what they will look at is exactly the kind of evidence that you're recording. The independent monitoring notes, published contracts, signed addenda, and credible payment records. Now last but not least, you'll see here on the left of the screen our corruption scheme 3. So this scheme points straight at weaknesses in anti-corruption policies, risk assessment and protections against big rigging and unfair competition. Element 7 assumed that there is a real anti-corruption framework, so conflicts of interest are checked, risky suppliers have been screened, and tenders are protected against collusion. Now, secret subcontractors, unexplained logos on site, or front companies with the same owners are all classic ways to bypass those safeguards and to hide who's actually really being favoured. So when you're working through the reporting template tool and answering the questions about contract modifications, quantities, payments, and who's actually present on site, you're not just filling in administrative details. You're seeing it here in practice. You're stress testing whether a project would live up to the expectations behind Blue Dot Element 7. Each factual note that you add, whether it be about an odd contract change, a missing part of the works, or a mystery company, they're all a small but concrete piece of evidence about whether this infrastructure project is being run with integrity or whether these 3 schemes are quietly eating away at it. Now, corruption in infrastructure can take many forms across the life cycle of a project. So it's useful to know the bigger picture, even though this module focuses on the implementation phase explicitly. But if you take a closer look at this image on the slide, you can almost feel how expensive this project is. Globally, construction output is expected to reach around 17.5 trillion a year by the end of 2030, and estimates suggest that up to 6 trillion a year could be lost through corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency. So when we talk about corruption in infrastructure, we're not just talking about a few bad invoices. What we're actually talking about is losses on the scale of national budgets. So you'll see here that the first bullet point here is to remind us that the big money plus urgency equals big temptation. After COVID, many of us saw that governments poured money into infrastructure to stimulate the economy, but the more pressure there is to build fast, the more likely it is that checks and balances got relaxed and that loophole stays open. So if we walk quickly through the life of a typical infrastructure project, then I'll show you where this module actually fits in. So at the very beginning, decisions are made about what to build, where, and for how much. Corruption at this stage can look like projects being chosen because they benefit a particular politician, landowner, or connected company rather than actually because they serve the community needs. Over-designed or overpriced projects also link in here. Think about a gold-plated road or a social housing project with unnecessarily expensive specifications. This is also where technical requirements tailored to one preferred supplier also come in. But none of that is actually visible on site yet, so it sets the tone and it locks high costs and weak competition from day one, but you may not actually see it. When moving to the tender stage, the same pattern can continue, but here corruption can look like tenders quietly being advertised or structured so that only a small circle of companies even know that they exist, confidential information on prices or evaluation leaked to a favoured bidder, and companies agreeing among themselves who will win and who will submit the cover bids, which is classic bid rigging. Officials also tend to ask for kickbacks or in-kind favours in exchange for steering the award. But the OECD has found that around 15% of international bribery cases involve the construction sector, which gives a sense of how attractive this phase is for corrupt behaviour. Now, if we take a look at the construction stage, this is exactly where Module 3 lives. So first, unjustified modifications and scope creep are Corruption Scheme 1. Because infrastructure projects are unique and complex, they often need changes, but that complexity can be abused, so extra works and time extensions can be inserted through variation orders that are poorly justified or split into many small changes that no one reviews properly, meaning that costs may go up, but it's no longer clear whether the community is really getting extra value. Now, if we look at our Corruption Scheme 2, the Transparency International work on infrastructure points out that materials and quality are often literally hidden. So steel gets covered in concrete, you may see electrical cables disappear behind walls, and pipes run through ducts that no one even opens. So inspectors or supervisors can be persuaded to sign off anyway, but you can end up with documents saying 100% delivered, while the reality is that the structure is much weaker or partly missing. Now if we take a look at a Corruption Scheme 3, whether it be a small or large project, nearly all always involve many subcontractors, and of course it's normal, but the problem is when companies appear on site that are not actually listed anywhere in the contract. You may even see that front companies are used to disguise who's really doing the work and who's really getting paid. So that's a classic way to hide conflicts of interest or even to pass the work down to politically connected firms. So you can see here that all three of the schemes are exactly what the reporting template is designed to pick up later in Step 1 and Step 2. Unusual modifications, mismatches between payments and visible progress, and also company logos on site that don't actually match the formal list. Now, even once a project has been finished, corruption can continue. You could see this through operation and maintenance contracts being awarded with the same problems as the original tender. This could be through seeing weak competition, favours for insiders, inflated prices, and so on. So there can be ghost workers on maintenance contracts or inflated bills for repairs that were never actually done. Now, audits, if they do happen at all, can definitely become a tick-the-box exercise if the auditors are under pressure to keep a big client or a powerful public body happy. So the message for you here is very simple. Corruption in infrastructure can appear at every phase, from choosing the project to awarding the contract, to building, to operating and auditing. But in this module, we're zooming in on the implementation phase as mentioned, so the concrete, the tarmac, the playground equipment, the subcontractors, because that's where monitors can actually stand on the ground, look around and use the reporting template tool to document whether what was promised on paper really exists and who's delivering it. So if we now take a look at the typical risk patterns linked to the procurement procedure itself, these patterns help explain why certain problems appear later on site. They don't automatically mean that there is corruption, but these type of situations definitely do show where our three corruption schemes are more likely to appear later in the project. So taking a look here at first row, this is about favoritism, so where a bidder is closely linked to the person or company that designed the technical specifications. Here the main concern refers to conflict of interest, so the designer quietly shapes the tender so that their preferred bidder is the only realistic winner. Now, if that preferred company doesn't actually have the capacity to deliver, this is where we often see Corruption Scheme 3. The favoured company wins the contract, then immediately passes most of the work to hidden or unapproved subcontractors. On the ground, you could also slide this into Corruption Scheme 2. So it could be substandard or poor quality work compared to the payment, because the real implementer is underqualified or even underpaid at that matter. So this pattern is especially important in works and services contracts where the design or supervision company has a lot of influence, but sometimes you'll only see the results during implementation, but it does actually often start right here with the designer-linked favoritism. Now if we take a look at the second row, which is about multiple small, less competitive procedures, which may indicate contract splitting. On paper, each tender is small enough to avoid stricter rules or open competition, but in reality, together they form one big package. Again, the immediate risk factor here is conflict of interest, because the buyer wants to favour a particular supplier and slices the project into pieces just to stay under thresholds or even to invite only a small circle of bidders. But this pattern most often feeds directly into corruption scheme 1. Once the supplier is in, additional lots or add-ons appear and the real size of the project only becomes visible later through amendments. Now, it can also create pressure for corruption scheme 2 through rushed or piecemeal delivery, because the supplier is juggling so many small contracts with tight deadlines. You can see this across works, goods and service contracts, so when you check the contract history in the monitoring tool, it's important to ask, was this project artificially sliced into many smaller awards? Taking a look at the third pattern, this is when a competitive tender has been cancelled and then replaced by a less competitive procedure. Obviously, sometimes there are genuine reasons for cancellations, but when a cancelled open tender is followed by a direct award or even a very restricted procedure, the risk of favouritism and conflicts of interest does go up. So once the preferred supplier is selected under weaker competition, it becomes easier for corruption scheme 1, the time and scope creep through modifications to appear, because there's less pressure to keep prices and deadlines under control. Now, corruption scheme 2 again can follow in the background if quality is allowed to slide without fear of actually being challenged by losing competitors. So this pattern can appear in all three categories, works, goods and service contracts. So again, in your monitoring notes, it's useful to record how the contract was finally awarded and whether there was cancelled tender just before. But if we take a look here at the last pattern, over restrictive eligibility or technical criteria, this is when the requirements are drafted in such a narrow way that only one or very small number of suppliers can actually qualify. So let's take, for example, by naming one of the specific brands or insisting on experience that almost nobody has. Once more, the core risk factor here is conflict of interest, because the rules may be shaped with a particular company or product in mind, but when that happens, it often leads back to corruption scheme 1, because the locked-in solution later needs expensive tweaks, upgrades, or even complementary contracts. So if there's no real alternatives in the market, there's also a higher chance of corruption scheme 2, because the buyer has less leverage to insist on quality. This can appear in works, goods and service contracts, so whenever you see very narrow criteria, it's important to note, rather than a corruption scheme explicitly coming up, it may be a risk pattern, so then watch how the project evolves during implementation. So in summary, you've seen here that these procurement stage patterns are not proof of wrongdoing, but they are early warning signs. So when you can see that our 3 corruption schemes during execution, they are often because of one of these patterns that have been present from the beginning. Now if we move to risk patterns that appear after a contract has been signed, this is usually through amendments and extensions. Of course they can be completely legitimate, but projects change and contracts sometimes need to follow. So that's where we're interested in looking at our patterns that tend to go hand in hand with our corruption schemes. Now, when amendments or extensions lack proper formal justification, the primary scheme here is corruption scheme 1. So if the contract value or duration increases, but the file constraints only show very vague explanations, or sometimes no clear legal basis at all, no references to new needs, or even no solid evidence, then this also raises the risk of corruption scheme 2, paying for unnecessary or low quality work. So in repeated cases, it can also suggest a conflict of interest, where maybe you'll see connected supplier routinely granted favourable changes without real scrutiny. So for you as monitors, the key here is not to judge the legal wording, but make sure to check that there's a real clear concrete justification that matches what's actually seen on the ground. These are usually most common in works and services, but sometimes appear in goods contracts when extra deliveries are added informally. Now, when we focus on multiple or serial amendments, a single well-justified amendment is not a problem, but the red flag lies when the same contract has been changed again and again through new addenda, new extensions, or new items. This is still corruption scheme 1, but we're now watching the volume and frequency of changes. So over time, repeated amendments tend to erode delivery quality, which I'm sure many of you have seen. This is where corruption scheme 2 appears, so substandard output compared to what is ultimately paid. To cope with all of these changes, the main contractor may actually pull in extra capacity through corruption scheme 3, bringing in unapproved subs when they struggle to keep up. So this is usually visible in works and complex service contracts where projects last several years. but in your monitoring template, you'll see the question about number and type of modifications, and this is meant to capture exactly this. Now, if we look at amendments that introduce substantial changes to the scope of the contract itself, here again, we are in Corruption Scheme 1 territory, major scope changes that effectively make the contract very different from what was originally tendered. So let's take, for instance, switching to a different technical solution, adding entirely new components, or radically increasing quantities. When this happens, it often results in Corruption Scheme 2, misfit solutions and quality slippage, because the project's now delivering something that was never actually properly completed or designed. So these kind of amendments can also reveal conflicts of interest if the revised scope disproportionately benefits the incumbent contractor or even closely related companies. So you'll usually see this in works contracts, but it can also appear in goods and services as well. So the practical question during the reporting template tool here is, does the project that is being built still look like the project that was originally procured? If the answer is not really, then this risk pattern is present and should be described in your notes. So last but not least, the risk patterns here sit where you spend most of your time as a civic monitor, during delivery and execution. These are the situations you're most likely to see with your own eyes or document through photos, site visits, and local interviews. So you'll see here that the first row is when payments are not in line with what is being delivered. That's a classic Corruption Scheme 2. Invoices and payment certificates suggest everything has been completed, but on site you see missing sections, unfinished works, or even lower quality materials. Now, sometimes after the fact, Corruption Scheme 1 appears as well. So modifications used to retroactively justify the overpayment. A new variation order or addendum is drafted to explain why so much money has already been paid. But if acceptance seems unusually lenient toward a supplier with political or personal connections, then you can also touch on conflict of interest risks, but again, that by itself is a risk factor, not automatic proof of corruption. So this pattern can arise in works, goods, and service contracts. In the reporting template tool, any mismatch between physical reality and the documented payment progress should definitely be recorded carefully. Now, when execution is not actually in line with progress reports, here the documents say that certain stages or milestones have been completed, but you know that your field visit shows gaps such as activities not being started, materials missing, or whole components unfinished. That's again Corruption Scheme 2, with the paper trail pretending that everything's fine. To fill in the gaps, we sometimes see Corruption Scheme 1 here, so modifications to correct scope or time on paper, and Corruption Scheme 3, unreported teams or subcontractors actually doing the work without clearly being listed in the contract. So you'll usually see this in works and services, especially supervision or soft components, where the deliverables are reported, and trainings. So as monitors, compare what the report claims with what people in the community actually experience. Now, looking at row 3, this deals with execution that does not match the delivery schedule. So delays in rescheduling can have many legitimate causes, whether that be the weather, you might see supply chain issues or unforeseen ground conditions. So by itself, a delay is not actually corruption, but persistent or unexplained delays you've probably seen increase the likelihood of Corruption Scheme 2, which is late or incomplete delivery relative to the payment, and that often leads into Corruption Scheme 1, claims for extra time and extra money through modifications. So to recover from such delays, contractors may also resort to Corruption Scheme 3 through last-minute unapproved subcontractors to catch up quickly by bringing in extra teams who are not properly controlled. So you'll see here that this is a cross-cutting pattern in works, goods and services. So in your notes, it's important to document not just that there was a delay, but you need to mention how it was justified and whether the new timetable looks realistic. Now, the fourth row is excessive or irregular subcontracting. Here the main scheme is Corruption Scheme 3. That's when a large share of the work has been shifted to companies not clearly identified or approved, or even clearly suited for the tasks being done. So over-reliance on such subcontractors is strongly associated with Corruption Scheme 2 because control becomes weaker, the quality often drops. It can also hide conflicts of interest, for example when front companies or shells secretly link to the main contractor or to public officials. So the pattern here is most visible in works and service contracts, but during site visits, pay attention to which company logos you actually see on vehicles, uniforms and signage, and then compare that to the subcontractor list in the contract documents. When looking at access denial or obstruction to monitoring, by itself that does not automatically mean corruption, and that's where a lot of you may get confused, because like conflict of interest, obstruction of monitoring is a risk factor. So it's the least weighted red flag because there can be reasons for limiting access such as safety rules, maybe you've even seen it through restricted areas or simple misunderstandings with contract authority, However, when access is repeatedly blocked, or when information is systematically withheld, or key experts are always unavailable, it does become much easier for the other schemes to operate. So in practice, we often see that the poor quality or missing outputs are later patched up using Corruption Scheme 1, and that certain companies consistently benefit from these adjustments, with, again, raising conflict of interest questions. So the pattern can appear in all contracts, works, goods and services, and the most important thing for you here is to record precisely who denied access, when and with what explanation. So even if you can't see the works, the denial itself becomes part of the evidence. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of module 3, but before we close I want to quickly connect the dots of what we've just gone through and how it prepares you for the next sessions. First, we shifted away from the idea that the corruption in construction is just about a single bribe or a single bad person. Instead, we framed your monitoring work around 3 recurring corruption schemes that will continuously show up again and again in infrastructure projects. First being unjustified contract modifications and scope creep. Second, substandard or undelivered outputs compared to the payments being made. And last but not least, irregular or phantom subcontracting. Now, these 3 schemes give you a simple lens to interpret what you see in the documents but also on the construction site. Secondly, we place those schemes inside a bigger picture, if you remember the Blue Dot Network Element 7 and the OECD standards behind it. So the message here is that your observations are not random. When you look at modifications, quantities, payments, or even who's really on site, you're actually touching on the same expectations that serious international investors and public authorities use when they talk about quality infrastructure and what transparent procurement looks like. So in other words, every careful note you record in the reporting tool is a small piece of evidence for or against those integrity standards. Thirdly, we unpacked risk patterns across 3 moments of the project. During the procurement procedure, when contracts are amended and extended, and during delivery and execution. So for each pattern, we saw how it often links back to one of 3 our corruption schemes and how it can create space for abuse without automatically proving that corruption has actually happened. Now, this is really important because a conflict of interest, access denial, or even a messy sequence of amendments are all risk signals but not automatic accusations. So your job is to notice them, describe them clearly, and connect them to what you can actually observe, but don't jump to conclusions. So going forward, I invite you to keep 3 questions in mind whenever you look at a climate or small infrastructure project. One being, which scheme could this fit into? Is this mainly about modifications, about payments versus reality, or about who's actually doing the work? Second, which risk patterns are present? So for example, let's think of serial amendments, over-restrictive criteria, or execution that doesn't actually match the progress report you're seeing. And thirdly, what can I document in a neutral way? So the photos, contract excerpts, dates, names of companies on site, anything that you feel will help transform a vague concern into a traceable observation. So in part 2, we'll get much more practical. We'll take the same schemes and risk patterns and translate them into concrete checklist questions inside the iMonitor reporting template tool. We'll go section by section and see exactly where you can record these signals and how to phrase them so that they can be useful for later analysis and even possible follow-up. So thank you for completing part 1 of module 3. If you can, before starting the next video, think of one real or hypothetical scenario in your country and try to spot at least one risk pattern from today. Bring that mental example with you to part 2 and we'll use it to make the checklist feel even more concrete.